There is a point along the main road north of Munich where a narrow track branches away to the left and disappears almost immediately between the fields. It is not marked by anything in particular. The junction is unassuming, a gap in the verge, a pair of shallow ruts pressed into the earth by wheels that have passed over the same ground many times. The grass between them growing a little higher than the surrounding soil because it receives less light, less compression. Within perhaps 30 meters of leaving the road, the track has curved enough that the farmstead it leads to cannot be seen from any passing vantage point. By the time it curves again, bending gently in the direction of the tree line, the main road itself has disappeared from view. Someone standing at the far end of that track would not be visible from the public road. Someone standing at the public road, looking toward where the track diverges, would see only fields and the distant edge of a wood and the open sky above the agricultural plain of Upper Bavaria. This is where the farm called Hinterkaifeck stood. It was located approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich in the Schrobenhausen district of Upper Bavaria, near the village of Weidhofen, on ground that had been worked for generations. The name itself is a compound in the way of Bavarian farm names, a geographical identification rather than a title, and the property it named was a working farmstead of the kind that had existed in this part of Germany for centuries, serving no purpose that was not entirely practical and existing in no way that was not entirely ordinary. The land was agricultural. The building was built for the work of agriculture. The people who lived there were farmers who farmed it. The narrow track that led from the main road to the property ran through open fields before it reached the farm's boundaries, and at certain points along its length, the ground on either side dropped away slightly, so that the track sat a little elevated above the surrounding terrain and could be walked or driven without difficulty in dry conditions. In wet conditions, it would have been muddy and slow. In winter, with frost in the soil, it would have been firm again. In the particular late March of 1922, with snow still covering the ground in the fields on either side, and a residual cold keeping overnight temperatures below freezing, the surface of that track held the definition of whatever passed over it with the kind of clarity that only a firm, undisturbed snow cover allows. The track arrived at the farmstead without announcement. There was no gate of any formal kind, no marker at the boundary that would have been visible to a traveler. The property simply began where the fields gave way to a more actively managed yard, and the difference between the open ground of the approach and the enclosed space of the farm was a matter of use and arrangement rather than any clear physical boundary. The yard itself was surrounded on multiple sides by outbuildings, a woodshed, a tool storage structure, a smaller auxiliary building that served the farm's practical needs, in the way such structures always do on a working agricultural property, each one placed in the particular relationship to the others that had accumulated over years of use. The layout not planned in any formal sense, but arrived at through the slow accretion of practical decisions. At the center of the property, and the structure that defined it, was the main building. It was a Wohnstallhaus, a word that names a thing precisely and leaves nothing out. Wohn, dwelling, stall, stable, house, house. A building that contained both the human domestic space and the agricultural working space of the farm under a single continuous roof, the two halves accessible to each other from inside, the warm breath of the livestock present in the shared walls and floors of both. This construction style was entirely traditional to rural Bavaria and to this region in particular. The farmhouse half of the building held the kitchen, the sleeping quarters, the domestic rooms where food was prepared and stored, and where the daily rhythms of household life were conducted. The barn half held the cattle, the horse, the hay stored for winter feeding, and the tools and implements of agricultural work. Between the two halves, an interior passage allowed movement without stepping outside into the yard. The building presented as a single elongated structure under one shared roofline, long and low and practical, oriented to the needs of the land and the animals and the people who worked both. The external barn doors opened outward toward the central yard, large enough to admit a loaded cart, set into the barn wall with the simple hardware of farm construction: iron hinges, a wooden bar, the kind of fitting that receives daily use and is maintained accordingly. Inside, the stalls where the livestock were housed occupied the lower sections of the barn, with hay stored in the upper areas and accessible by ladder or internal structure. The smell that would have been present inside that building, even in winter, even on the coldest morning, was the warm, dense, organic smell of housed animals, the ammonia of the bedding, the sweetness of the hay, the particular warmth that a small number of large animals generates in an enclosed space, a warmth that in cold months was not unpleasant, that was in fact a resource of its own kind. The body heat of the cattle, making the shared wall of the farmhouse slightly warmer than it would otherwise have been. The residential half of the farmhouse contained the rooms where the household conducted its interior life. The kitchen was the practical center: the stove, the work table, the stored provisions, the place where the day began and ended in terms of the physical maintenance of living. In a farmstead of this kind and era, the kitchen was not a room apart from the work of the farm. It was continuous with it. The dairy work that turned the milk of the cattle into products that could be stored and used and sold required both the animals in the barn and the space and implements of the kitchen, and the movement between the two halves of the building was a regular and unremarkable part of any day's labor. The stored grain that fed the livestock also represented the farm's reserve food supply, and the division between what belonged to the animals and what belonged to the household was practical and approximate rather than absolute. The bedrooms were upstairs or in the rear sections of the building, depending on the farmhouse's particular internal arrangement. Above the main living quarters, the attic ran the length of the building, a stored space, a structural buffer between the rooms below and the roof above, the kind of space common to farmhouses of this type and used for the storage of goods that needed to be kept dry and accessible without being in the main domestic rooms. In winter, the attic would have been cold. The heat of the rooms below would rise into it to some degree, but not enough to make it comfortable, only enough to prevent the kind of deep freeze that would damage stored materials. In a building of this age and construction, the attic floor would have been timber boards laid over the structural joists, the kind of surface that carried sound downward with clarity, that would transmit the weight of footsteps with particular fidelity to anyone in the rooms below. The outbuildings of the yard completed the physical inventory of the farm. A woodshed held the cut and stacked fuel for the stove and the fireplace, essential in a Bavarian winter, and the maintenance of the wood supply was a seasonal labor that marked the agricultural calendar as clearly as planting or harvest. A tool shed held the implements of farm work, the spades and mattocks and scythes and harrows of a working agricultural property, the kind of collection that accumulated over years and was maintained continuously because the work never stopped and the tools were always in use. Smaller storage structures held grain, preserved food, seasonal equipment. Each building was of simple construction: timber, stone, the materials at hand, placed in the yard in the arrangement that long use had established, and that was not reconsidered because it functioned as it had always functioned. From inside the yard, the farm felt enclosed. The arrangement of the buildings created a space that was bounded on multiple sides, sheltered from the open fields beyond, the kind of enclosure that served a practical purpose in terms of wind and weather, and also created a particular quality of interior quiet, the sense of being in a defined place, with walls, however simple those walls might be. From the road, the farm could not be seen. From the farm, the road was equally absent. The property sat in its own geography, defined by the fields around it and the tree line at its boundary, connected to the wider world by the single unpaved track, but not visually or acoustically continuous with that world. The broader landscape of Upper Bavaria in the area around Hinterkaifeck was agricultural throughout. The Schrobenhausen district was, and remains, a region of arable and dairy farming, flat or gently rolling ground, the occasional low ridge, the characteristic pattern of fields and farmsteads and small villages that has characterized this part of central Bavaria for centuries. The land is not dramatic. There are no mountains visible from this particular stretch of the Bavarian plain. The horizon is the horizon of a farming landscape, the distant tree line, the near field boundary, the sky above both. In late March, the birch and poplar at the edges of the fields would have been in their earliest hesitation toward spring, the branches still largely bare, but beginning to show the first minimal trace of budding, the change not yet visible at any distance, but present if examined closely. The village of Weidhofen, the nearest settlement to the farmstead, lay within a few kilometers of the property. The nearest town of any practical scale, Schrobenhausen, was approximately 10 kilometers away along the roads available in 1922. That distance, in the context of the transportation available to a rural farming family in the years immediately following the First World War, was a meaningful one. A horse and cart on an unpaved road in uncertain late winter conditions would have covered that distance slowly and with effort. A person on foot would have taken 2 hours or more depending on conditions. The farm was not remote in any absolute sense. It was a documented property in an established agricultural district, with neighbors within a kilometer and a market town within reach. But the practical reach of any emergency, the time it would take for news to travel from the farm to any authority in either direction, was measured in hours rather than minutes. The years immediately following the end of the First World War had left rural Bavaria in conditions that made the ordinary difficulties of agricultural life more acute. The war had removed labor from the countryside, young men drafted, some killed, some returned in damaged conditions, all of them absent for years from the farms that had depended on their work. The economic disruption of the post-war period had introduced food scarcity and financial instability into communities that had operated on narrow margins even before the war. Farms like Hinterkaifeck continued to function through the mechanisms they had always relied upon: the self-sufficiency of livestock and stored grain and preserved food, the cycle of seasonal agricultural work that did not stop because the wider world was in difficulty, the social rhythms of market days and church attendance, and the limited regular contact with neighbors that constituted the external life of a working rural household. A farm of this kind in this period was, in a practical sense, as complete a world as it was possible for a small parcel of land to be. The food produced there fed the people who produced it. The animals provided milk, labor, and meat. The stored grain carried the household through the winter months when the fields produced nothing. The skills accumulated over generations of farming the same land allowed a degree of self-sufficiency that insulated the household from the worst of external economic conditions, while also limiting its connection to any support those external systems might provide. The farm was its own economy, its own schedule, its own set of obligations and routines. The distance between the farm and Schrobenhausen was not only a physical distance of 10 kilometers. In 1922, on the roads available, it was a distance that represented hours of travel, time for conditions to change, time for whatever had been urgent to become something else. The nearest neighboring farmstead to Hinterkaifeck was approximately 1 kilometer distant. That neighbor was the nearest fixed point of human habitation in the farm's immediate landscape, close enough to be reached on foot in a quarter of an hour under good conditions, close enough that smoke from the Hinterkaifeck chimney would have been visible across the intervening fields on a clear day. Bavarian farming communities of this period maintained the kind of informal awareness of their neighbors that comes from long proximity in a sparse landscape, the observation of who was seen in their fields, whose wagon passed on the road, whether the chimney was smoking at the expected time of morning. This awareness was not surveillance. It was the ordinary byproduct of living close enough to see and far enough apart that every sighting carried the simple interest of contact. The physical world of the farm in late March 1922 was the world of the end of winter. The agricultural year was preparing to turn. The early spring work, the opening of the soil, the first planting of cold season crops, the maintenance and repair of the buildings and equipment after the winter months was at its threshold. The days were lengthening, the angle of the sun was changing, but the ground was still cold, and the nights still dropped below freezing, and the snow that had accumulated through the winter months was still present across the fields and in the sheltered corners of the yard, and along the unpaved track that led from the main road to the farm. Snow at this stage of the year, in the transitional week between the last cold of winter and the first warmth of early spring, had a particular character. It was not the fresh, loose snow of midwinter. It had been through multiple cycles of partial melting and refreezing, each cycle compressing it slightly, consolidating it, removing the soft surface texture, and replacing it with a firmer layer that held its shape more durably. A footstep pressed into this surface did not disappear with the next snowfall, or soften into indistinction with the next warm hour. It remained. It kept the shape of what had made it, the weight, the length, the direction of travel, the pattern of the soul, until a genuine thaw came, until the temperature climbed enough to soften the consolidated surface and release it. The record it held was stable. The fields surrounding Hinterkaifeck in late March 1922 were covered with this kind of snow. The unpaved track was covered with it. The yard inside the arrangement of outbuildings held it in the sheltered corners where the winter cold had been most insulated from the thin warmth of the late winter sun. The ground between the farm and the tree line at the property's edge, a stretch of open field, exposed to the sky and to whatever crossed it, was covered with a continuous surface of consolidated late winter snow that had not yet released to the season that was approaching. This kind of surface was a record of movement. It was a medium that preserved the evidence of crossing. To person or animal moving across it, left impressions that were specific and durable, each step a distinct mark in the consolidated snow, the direction of travel readable from the pattern, the absence of a return path as legible as the presence of an outward one. A track crossing a snow-covered field told an observer where something had come from, and if the observer was attending carefully, where it had gone afterward, or whether it had gone at all. The distance from the tree line at the edge of the Hinterkaifeck property to the farm buildings in the yard was not large. The fields of Upper Bavaria are not wilderness. The forest that bordered the property was not a deep wood, but a functional tree line, the kind of boundary between farmed land and managed forestry that was ordinary in this part of Bavaria. The trees unremarkable at a distance, the space between them at ground level open enough to move through without difficulty. The path from that tree line to the yard of the farm, across the snow-covered field, was a walk of perhaps a few minutes. The ground between the 2 points was open and flat. The snow that covered it in late March 1922 was consolidated and firm and clear, and would have kept, with fidelity and without any need for interpretation, every mark pressed into it during the nights and mornings when the temperature held below the freezing point. The farm sat in this landscape as it had always sat at the end of its narrow track, enclosed within its yard. The elongated Wohnstallhaus, with its single shared roofline running the length of the building, the livestock in their stalls on the barn side, the domestic rooms on the residential side, the kitchen stove holding its fire against the cold, the stored provisions in the outbuildings maintaining the particular quiet inventory of a working farm in the final weeks of winter. The fields around it were still. The track was empty. The tree line at the edge of the property cast its shadows across the open ground between the wood and the yard in the long, low light of the late March afternoon, and the snow that covered those fields and the track and the open ground between the tree line and the buildings lay as it had lain through the winter months, undisturbed in its wider reaches, marked only where the daily traffic of the farm had passed, each impression held in the consolidated surface with the particular patience of ground that has not yet thawed, that is still cold enough to keep what has been pressed into it, that will continue to keep it until the season finally changes. The ground around Hinterkaifeck in late March 1922 was the kind of ground that recorded what crossed it. It received the impressions made upon it and held them. It did not require any interpretation to perform this function. It did not require any observer to give it purpose. The snow was simply snow, consolidated, firm, cold, and it did what such a surface does, which is to keep what has been left in it until warmth comes and releases everything into the ordinary, undifferentiated ground of spring. The farm stood at the end of its track in the open agricultural landscape north of Munich, at the margin of the winter that was passing and the spring that had not yet arrived. The fields around it were white and still. The yard was enclosed. The tree line at the property's edge was dark in the fading afternoon light, and the ground between the tree line and the buildings, across the open field, across the surface of firm and consolidated and patient late winter snow, lay quiet and entirely readable, a surface that would keep its record, whatever that record turned out to be, for as long as the temperature held and the thaw did not come. In this landscape, movement left a trace. The ground was cold enough to hold it. The season had not yet turned far enough to take it away. Whatever had crossed the snow-covered fields of Hinterkaifeck in the final days of March 1922 had left its mark in the surface of the ground, and the surface of the ground, in the particular stillness of that transitional week between winter and early spring, was keeping it faithfully as ground in that condition keeps everything that has been pressed into it, without judgment, without urgency, simply as a matter of the cold doing what the cold does, holding the shape of the world as it was at the moment the impression was made. Andreas Gruber was born in 1866 in the agricultural country of Upper Bavaria, and by the time he was in his 60s, he had spent the better part of his life working the land at Hinterkaifeck. That span of years, from the mid-19th century to the early 1920s, encompassed an entire era of Bavarian rural life, the slow turn from one century to the next, the disruption of a world war, the difficult years that followed. He was 63 years old in the spring of 1922. The farm was his. The documented record of Andreas Gruber, gathered from neighbors, local accounts, and the investigative files compiled after the events of that spring, describes a man who was known for being difficult. The word used across multiple accounts, in one form or another, was quarrelsome. He was understood by those who knew him to be secretive, to keep the farm's affairs, its finances, its arrangements, its dealings with the wider world, drawn close and private. He was distrustful of outsiders, and this was not simply the generalized wariness of a rural farmer in a hard decade. The people who knew him registered it as something more particular, a habitual preference for managing his world on his own terms and keeping others, including those from his own district, at a deliberate remove. His connection to the land at Hinterkaifeck was the central and defining fact of his documented life. He had worked that property for decades, and he understood it the way a man understands something he has walked and maintained and relied on through every kind of weather. He was not a large figure in the community around Weidhofen. He was not a prominent man. The farm he ran was a working property, not a prosperous one, producing what it produced and operating largely within itself, as most farms in that part of Upper Bavaria did in those years. He attended church. He appeared at market days. He conducted the limited range of business dealings that the farm required. Beyond that, he kept to his property, and the property kept to him. That is what the record shows. A man in his 60s, formed by decades of agricultural labor, known by his neighbors in the way that neighbors know one another when they do not seek out each other's company, and managing the farm at the end of the narrow, unpaved track with the same deliberate self-sufficiency he had always applied to it. Cecilia Gruber, née Sturzer, was born in 1874 and was 47 years old in the spring of 1922. She is described in the accounts gathered from those who knew the household as a quieter figure than her husband. Where Andreas was quarrelsome and given to friction, Cecilia was reserved, not withdrawn, but quieter, a woman who occupied the domestic interior of the farm and whose presence in the house was organized around the work of keeping it running. The record gives her the texture of someone whose life was structured by practical labor, cooking, food preservation, the dairy work that structured the daily rhythms of a working Bavarian farm, the interior management of a household that operated largely in self-sufficiency. These were not small tasks. In a farmstead like Hinterkaifeck, removed from the nearest town by 10 kilometers of cart track and field road, the smooth running of the domestic interior was as essential to the farm's survival as the agricultural work carried out in the fields and the barn. What was preserved, what was stored, what was prepared, all of it depended on the ongoing attention of the person who ran the household's inside world. She had been with Andreas for the full span of their married life, and the household they ran together was the household into which their daughter Victoria had been born. The documentary record does not give Cecilia Gruber a large number of words. The accounts of her are consistent but brief, quieter than her husband, managing her domain, keeping the inside of the farm as he kept the outside. Her image in the record is that of someone present and practical, her days shaped by the same seasonal rhythms that shaped all rural Bavarian life in that period, the turning of work with the turning of the year. Victoria Gabriel was born in 1894 and was 27 years old at the time of the killings. She was the daughter of Andreas and Cecilia, and in the years before 1922, her circumstances had been shaped by a set of events that placed her in her late 20s back inside the farmhouse where she had grown up. Her husband, Carl Gabriel, had been reported killed in action on the Western Front in 1914. She was left a widow in her early 20s, with a young child and no independent means of support, and the farm at Hinterkaifeck, her parents' farm, was where she went. That kind of return was not unusual in the rural communities of wartime and post-war Bavaria. The war had left enormous numbers of women in precisely that position, widowed and dependent, folded back into the households they had come from. What the farm represented for Victoria was not chosen solitude, but practical necessity, the only available structure for a young woman with a child and no household of her own. She had 2 children living with her at Hinterkaifeck. There were, in the years following the events of spring 1922, documented questions and suspicions in the investigative record regarding the circumstances of certain family arrangements at the farm, including questions about paternity that investigators noted and that had attracted local attention, and at least one prior legal inquiry. These are recorded as suspicions and subjects of investigation, not as confirmed facts, and the record holds them as such. What the documentary evidence establishes without ambiguity is that Victoria was a widow in her late 20s, raising her children inside her parents' farmstead, contributing to the labor of the household, and living within the limited range of options available to a woman in her position in that time and place. She had grown up at Hinterkaifeck. The fields, the barn, the elongated Wandstall house with its connected agricultural and residential halves, the narrow track leading back to the main road. All of it was the landscape of her childhood, and now the landscape of her adult life. The farm was not new to her. Its routines were not new to her. She had moved through those rooms and that yard for all of her remembered years. The older of Victoria's 2 children was a girl named Cazalia Gabrielle, born in 1913 and 7 years old, in the spring of 1922. She was named for her grandmother, the older Cecilia, who ran the farmhouse's domestic interior, and the 2 of them, grandmother and granddaughter, shared the name through the daily life of a household, small enough that the distinction had to be managed by context and proximity. The younger Cecilia attended school in the nearby village, making the journey between the farm and the schoolhouse through the Bavarian countryside on the ordinary schedule of a child in education. Her teacher, in accounts gathered after the events of April 1922, described her as bright, cheerful, present and engaged in the classroom, a child who participated and attended to what was in front of her. That description, bright, cheerful, appears in the record as the testimony of someone who had seen her regularly, who had observed her across a span of school days, and it gives the younger Cazalia the specific texture of a living child in the particular world of a small rural Bavarian school. She walked that road. She sat in that classroom. She was described by someone who watched her there as a child who was genuinely present. The younger Cecilia had a brother. Joseph Gabriel was approximately 2 years old in early April 1922, born somewhere in 1919 or 1920. The precise date is recorded with some variation in different accounts. He was the youngest member of the Hinterkaifeck household, a toddler in the residential half of the farm, and his presence there in those years meant that the farmhouse held, alongside the labor and the daily work of agricultural life, the particular sounds and rhythms of a very young child. His birth had come several years after the reported death of Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, in 1914, a gap that had been noted in the community and that was among the details documented in the investigative record as a subject of prior inquiry. Josef was not yet old enough for school. He was not yet old enough to contribute to the farm's work. He was simply present, a small child inside the house, in the rooms his mother moved through, under the same roof as his grandmother and his grandfather and his sister. The 6 people of Hinterkaifeck in the spring of 1922 are these 5: Andreas, Cecilia Sr., Victoria, the younger Cecilia, and Joseph. The 6th arrived at the farm on March 31st, the day before the estimated date of the killings. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. The documented account of Maria Baumgartner is brief, because her time at Hinterkaifeck was brief. She had been hired as the household's maid, brought in to fill the vacancy left by the previous maid, who had departed the farm some weeks earlier. The previous maid's departure had left the household without the domestic help that farms of this kind typically relied upon, and the hiring of a replacement was a practical necessity. Maria came from outside the immediate district. She had no prior personal connection to the Gruber family. She had not worked for them before, had not known them through any social or commercial relationship, had not visited the property. She arrived as a new hire, a woman stepping into a household she had never entered, taking on a role in a home whose workings were entirely unfamiliar to her. She came with her belongings. She arrived on March 31st, 1922. The investigative and documentary record does not provide a detailed account of Maria Baumgartner's life before Hinterkaifeck. What it provides is her name, her origin outside the immediate district, the date of her arrival, and the single confirmed fact that she had one day at the farm, one day in which she would have moved through the kitchen and the domestic quarters, learned the geography of the household, understood the rhythms of the family she had come to work for, the older couple who ran the farm, the younger woman with her 2 children, the shared roof over the barn and the residential rooms, the yard and the outbuildings, and the long, flat, agricultural landscape surrounding the property on all sides. She arrived on the 31st. The estimated date of the killings is the night of March 31st to April 1st. What that means for the documentary shape of Maria Baumgartner's life is that she does not appear in the record before her arrival at Hinterkaifeck, and she does not appear in it after. There is one day, there is one crossing of the threshold into that unfamiliar house, and then there is what the investigation found. The record of these 6 people held together in that farmhouse at the end of the narrow unpaved track north of Munich is a record of specific documented lives. Andreas, 63, shaped by decades on his land. Cecilia, Sr., 47, managing the interior world of the farm. Victoria, 27, a widow living within the household of her childhood, raising her 2 children inside those walls. Cecilia the younger, 7 years old, making the journey to her school in the village and described there as bright and cheerful. Joseph, 2 years old, the youngest presence in the house, and Maria, newly arrived, without prior connection, beginning the work of a new position on the last day of March. They are worth holding at this pace, not as categories, not as victims, not as case subjects, but as people documented in the record of a particular time and place, each one carrying the specific weight of a distinct life. Andreas Gruber's life had unfolded across the full second half of the 19th century and into the 20th. He had been born before the unification of Germany, before the Franco-Prussian War, before most of the events that had shaped the political and social world he lived in as an older man. By the time he was working the farm at Hinterkaifeck as its owner and operator, he had seen the region change in ways both large and small. The slow transformation of rural Bavaria across half a century of modernization, the disruption of the First World War, and the enormous losses it had imposed on the farming communities of the region, the difficult post-war years with their poverty and social instability. He had navigated all of that while managing his land, handling his finances in his close and private way, keeping the farm's internal workings to himself. The quarrelsome quality attributed to him by neighbors is a word that carries weight without entirely defining a person. People who are described as quarrelsome are sometimes people who have strong opinions about how things should be done, who resist compromise, who find the arrangements that others accept to be arrangements they cannot let stand without a word. In an agricultural community in 1922, a difficult and domineering man who controlled the household's finances and dealings was not an unusual figure. The conditions of rural life in that era, the self-sufficiency, the isolation, the limited external oversight of what happened inside a family's walls, created space for particular kinds of domestic authority. What the record shows for Andreas is a man who exercised that authority, who kept his farm's affairs private, and who was not known for warmth or openness in his dealings with the world beyond the property. Cecilia Sr.'s quietness, described in accounts of those who knew the household, may reflect simply a temperamental difference from her husband, or it may reflect the ordinary subordination of a woman in a household run by a domineering man, or it may be that the people who described her did not know her well enough to report much else. The accounts are limited in what they offer. She was reserved. She managed the household's domestic work. She was the practical interior presence in a house where her husband was the controlling exterior figure. The record does not give her voice in the way it gives her husband friction. She appears in it as present and functional, which is not a complete portrait of a person, but is what the documentary evidence holds. Victoria's position in the household was shaped by the specific losses and constraints of her situation. She had been married. She had been widowed by war in her early 20s. She had returned to her parents' farm with a child and remained there, working within the household, raising her children alongside the agricultural and domestic labor of the farm. By 1922, she had been living at Hinterkaifeck for most of 8 years, the years since Carl Gabriel's reported death in 1914. Those were years of the war's continuation and its conclusion, of the difficult peace, of the slow and incomplete recovery of the Bavarian countryside. She had raised her daughter through those years inside those walls. She had had her second child during those years. The farm was the world her children knew. There is a particular quality to the lives of women in Victoria's position in that era. The widow without independent resources, folded back into the parental household, occupying a space between daughter and tenant, dependent and working, belonging to the household without heading it. The record does not editorialize about Victoria's experience of that position. It documents her presence there, the fact of her children, the labor she contributed to the farm's running, the fullness of her inner life, her experience of the years she spent at Hinterkaifeck between Carl Gabriel's death and the spring of 1922 is not something the documentary evidence can supply. What it supplies is her name, her age, her children, her status as a widow, and her presence in the house. The younger Cecilia walks through the record in a way that 7-year-olds walk through formal records. Briefly, in a few documented details, the outline of a child's life given by those who observed her from outside. Her teacher's account is what the record gives most clearly. Bright, cheerful, those words, offered by someone who had watched her over the course of a school year, carry the particular weight of an observed child, specific in her behavior, known by her teacher in the way a teacher knows a child, who is genuinely present in the room. She walked between the farm and the village school. She did that journey on the ordinary days of a school week, through the Bavarian countryside, whatever the March weather brought. She knew the road, she knew the classroom, she knew the farm at the other end of the walk, its yard and its rooms, and the grandmother whose name she shared. Joseph was 2 years old. There is not much a documentary record will hold of a 2-year-old who does not speak to neighbors, does not attend school, does not transact with the community. He is present in the investigative record by virtue of being found there. His age is noted. His mother is Victoria. He was inside the house. The record gives him a name and an age and a location, which is what the record can give a child who had not yet grown old enough to leave a larger trace in it. And Maria Baumgartner, what the documentation holds of her in the records assembled after the events of spring 1922, is not very much, because there was not much time for it to accumulate. She came from another district. She did not know the family. She had the position as maid because the previous maid had left, and the household needed the labor a maid provides. She carried her belongings to the farm on the last day of March, crossed the threshold of a house she had never visited, and began the work of orienting herself to an unfamiliar household. It is worth staying with that a moment, not with the events that followed, which belong to a different part of the record, but simply with the act of arriving, a young woman carrying her things to a new position. The farm at the end of the track, unfamiliar, the family she was coming to work for, known to her only as names and a hiring arrangement. The kitchen she had not yet learned, the routines she had not yet been shown. The older woman who managed the house's interior, the older man who managed its exterior, the younger woman with her 2 children, the 7-year-old and the toddler. These would have been, for Maria on the afternoon of March 31st, a household she was just beginning to read. The way one reads a new domestic situation, slowly and practically, learning where things are kept and what is expected, and how the rhythms of this particular household organize a working day. She was the last person to arrive at Hinterkaifeck. Of the 6 people in the farmhouse in those final days, she was the one with the least history there, the least time embedded in the farm's routines, the least accumulated connection to the people and the property. She had one day. The investigative record that documents the events of Hinterkaifeck notes her arrival date and records her presence among those found on April 4th. Between those 2 points, the crossing of the threshold on the 31st and the discovery 3 days later, the record of Maria Baumgartner is simply the fact of her presence inside that house. The household these 6 people formed was not a simple one. Andreas's controlling management of the farm and its dealings, his quarrelsome reputation, and his distrust of outside involvement, the complex circumstances of Victoria's situation, the prior inquiries that had touched the family's name and local legal records, these details, held in the documentary evidence and the accounts of neighbors and community members, describe a household with its own specific tensions and history. That history is part of what any honest account of the people of Hinterkaifeck must acknowledge. It is not the whole of them. Andreas was also a man who had worked his land for 40 years. Kazelia Sr. had kept a household running through the war and the difficult years after it, had preserved and cooked and managed the domestic interior of a self-sufficient farm through all of that. Victoria had raised her children through years of real hardship, inside walls she had known all her life. The younger Cecilia had been described as bright and cheerful by a person who watched her every school day and had reasons to know. Joseph was a child still in his first years of being in the world. Maria had come, with her belongings, to a new position, in good faith. The record holds all of this together, the difficult facts and the ordinary ones, the tensions in the household's history, and the simple daily life of a working farm in Upper Bavaria in the early 1920s. It holds them together because that is what the record does with real people who are always more than the most dramatic facts about them and who carry their ordinary lives alongside whatever larger events their stories end up becoming known for. Andreas Gruber, in his 6th decade, walking the yard of his farm in the late March cold. Cecilia, senior in the warm interior of the farmhouse kitchen, the dairy work and the preserved stores, and the steady management of a household that ran on practical labor. Victoria, 27, inside the house where she had grown up, her daughter preparing for another school day, her son in his small world of the interior rooms, the younger Cecilia, walking the road to the village, carrying whatever a 7-year-old carries on her way to school in the Bavarian countryside in 1922. Josef, 2 years old, present and unknowing, and Maria Baumgartner, arriving at the farm on the last day of March, stepping across the threshold of a house she did not know, carrying her belongings into the domestic quarters of a working Bavarian farmstead, beginning to learn the geography of rooms that were new to her. She had come from outside the district. She had no prior connection to the family. The position had been offered. She had taken it, and she made the journey and arrived. That is what the record shows of her first and only day at Hinterkaifeck, a woman stepping into an unfamiliar household, the farm receiving her as it received any new presence, the year still held in the cold of late March, the snow still covering the ground around the elongated Wohnstallhaus and the outbuildings and the narrow track that led back toward the main road. What the documentary evidence holds of these 6 people, their names, their ages, their relationships, the documented qualities attributed to them by those who knew them, the few vivid details that survived the passage of a century, is not a complete picture of any of them. Records like these are always partial. The full texture of a life is not something a neighbor's account or an investigative file can preserve. What remains is a set of confirmed particulars held in the archive, the outline of 6 people who lived and worked at a remote Bavarian farmstead in the early 1920s. Andreas, 63, the farm's owner and the household's dominant figure, quarrelsome and private, and shaped by decades of agricultural labor. Cecilia, 47, the quiet and practical center of the home's interior life. Victoria, 27, a widow in the house of her childhood, her children growing up in the same rooms where she had grown up. Cecilia the younger, 7 years old, described as bright and cheerful by the person who watched her in the village classroom. Josef, approximately 2, the youngest and least documented of them, present inside the house, and Maria Baumgartner, newly arrived on March 31st, 1922, from a district that was not her employer's, with no history at the farm and no connection to the family that had brought her there, carrying her things across a threshold into a household she had never visited before and would not leave. Her story and theirs overlapped by a single day. The record notes that overlap precisely her arrival date, the date the investigation fixed for the events that followed, and holds the brevity of that intersection without explanation or embellishment. She arrived on March 31st. She was there, and then, in the way the documentary record closes around the people it documents, she is held inside the farm at the end of the narrow track alongside the 5 people she had just met, the farm still standing, the snow still on the ground, the chimney smoke still rising across the flat agricultural landscape of Upper Bavaria. In the final days of March 1922, Andreas Gruber told his neighbor about the footprints. He described them as a single trail crossing the snow-covered field from the direction of the tree line, moving toward the farmstead. One set of impressions going in, no corresponding track coming back out. The surrounding snow was otherwise undisturbed, the field otherwise unmarked, and whatever had made those impressions in the cold ground of late March had left no record of its departure. This was the detail Gruber mentioned to a neighbor and separately to the local blacksmith in the days before the end of March 1922. He had seen the trail. He had noted its direction. He had noted the absence of a return path. And then he had continued with the work of the farm. The snow in Upper Bavaria in that final week of March would have been firm enough to hold an impression clearly. Winter was releasing its hold on the landscape slowly, and the overnight temperatures still dropped below freezing with regularity. A print left in that kind of snow, the dense, slightly settled surface of late-season snowfall, would hold its shape for days, the edges crisp and readable, the depth sufficient to show the weight and stride of whatever had made it. A trail of such prints crossing an open field would be visible from some distance, each impression distinct against the pale surface of the ground, a line drawn from one point to another, with no ambiguity about its direction. Gruber would have had no difficulty reading what he found. The trail went toward the farm. Nothing came back. The tree line that bordered the Hinterkaifeck property ran along the eastern edge of the agricultural land, where the cultivated fields gave way to the denser growth that was characteristic of the upper Bavarian countryside in that part of the Schrobenhausen district. The distance from the trees to the nearest outbuilding of the farmstead would have required whoever made those prints to cross an open stretch of ground, exposed, visible, the kind of crossing that takes time and leaves a record in precisely the kind of surface that late March provided. The prints Gruber found were specific. They had a starting point in the direction of the forest and an ending point at or near the farm, and no evidence of a return. This is what the case record shows, he reported. A trail with an origin and no departure. What Andreas Gruber did with that information, in practical terms, was to mention it. He did not file a report. He did not contact any authority. He carried the observation to 2 conversations. The neighbor, the blacksmith, and the conversations became part of the record of the final days of the farm, because those people later told investigators what Gruber had said to them. The conversations themselves are the only surviving evidence of how Gruber understood what he had found. He spoke about the prints. He described the single direction of the trail. He did not, as far as the record shows, treat the observation as something that required immediate action beyond those conversations. Whether this represents a decision made calmly or a matter he was still turning over in his mind, the record does not say. What it preserves is the fact that he spoke about it, and that the speaking was precise enough that the details were remembered and repeated after his death. The attic of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was accessible from within the residential portion of the building. It sat above the living quarters as attics do, and in the construction typical of a Bavarian Wohnstallhaus, it would have run the length of the roof, a low raftered space used for storage, reached by a fixed set of stairs or a pull-down access point from one of the upper rooms. In the same period when he had found the footprints in the snow, Gruber reported hearing sounds from this space. He described them as sounds consistent with movement overhead, footsteps, or something close to it, the kind of irregular, shifting sound that a person moving through a low-ceilinged storage space might produce. Not constant, not rhythmic, but present and recurrent in the days before the killings, and distinct enough that he noticed it, identified it as coming from above, and was unable to attribute it to any member of the household. He went up. This is documented. Andreas Gruber climbed to the attic and inspected the space and found no obvious explanation for what he had been hearing. The inspection is part of the account that reached investigators after the farm fell silent, recorded in the testimony of those who had spoken with Gruber in that final week. He had gone up and looked. He had not found anything that explained the sounds. He had come back down, and the farm had continued as it did. The livestock tended, the household in its daily rhythm, the sounds from the attic having produced an investigation that found nothing and was not, as far as the record shows, extended beyond that single inspection. It is worth pausing on what an attic inspection of that kind would have consisted of in a rural Bavarian farmhouse in 1922. A lantern or lamp carried up into a low, dark space, the stored objects of a working farm, tools put away, preserved goods, perhaps old furniture, the accumulated items that find their way above ceilings over the years of a household's life. A person moving through that space carefully, checking corners, looking for what might have made a sound, finding the ordinary inventory of storage, and nothing beyond it. Gruber would have known every item up there. He had owned the farm for decades. If something had been disturbed, if something had been moved or left that should not have been there, he would have been well placed to recognize it. The record of his account, as it came back through the neighbors who repeated it to investigators, does not describe him finding anything out of place. It describes him finding nothing and returning to the life of the farm below. The sounds from the attic continued after his inspection. The record does not specify exactly how many times Gruber described hearing them, or whether they occurred nightly or only occasionally, or whether other members of the household heard them, or whether this was an observation Gruber made alone. What the record preserves is the fact that the sounds were real to him, present enough that he both spoke about them and took the practical step of going to look. An attic above a working farmhouse is not a perfectly quiet space. Rafters settle, animals find their way into eaves, wind moves through gaps in roofing in ways that can suggest something heavier than weather. These are not explanations offered here as conclusions, only as the range of possibilities that existed then as they exist now, none of them confirmed by the surviving record, none of them ruled out by it. The maid who had worked at Hinterkaifeck in the weeks and months before Maria Baumgartner arrived had left. The exact timing of her departure and the precise circumstances are somewhat variable in the secondary accounts, but the documented core of the matter is that she had left the position, and that after her departure the accounts gathered from people who knew her describe a woman who had felt something was wrong at the farm. The word most consistently used in English language summaries of German source materials is unease, a pervasive sense of discomfort she could not fully explain, a feeling that accumulated during her time at the property and contributed to her decision to leave. Her name does not appear prominently in the surviving investigative summaries, which is itself part of the record's texture, a person who passed through the farm's history and whose account of her experience there became significant only in retrospect, after the household she had served was gone. She had been inside the farmhouse, she had worked in its kitchen and kept its rooms, and moved through its daily rhythms, and whatever she felt during that time was real enough to her to mention to others after she had gone. The accounts that describe her discomfort were gathered from the people she told, not from the woman herself, which means they carry the usual imprecision of testimony, passed through intermediaries, shaped by the receiver's memory and framing, arriving at the investigative record at some remove from their origin. What can be said, on the basis of what the record shows, is that she left. She left before the end of her expected engagement, before Maria Baumgartner was engaged as her replacement, and she described to people she knew something about her experience at the farm that they considered significant enough to repeat When investigators came asking, the specific content of that discomfort, what she heard, what she observed, what she felt in the domestic space of the farmhouse, is not preserved in the surviving record with the kind of precision that would allow a careful narration to quote it. It exists as an impression, a woman who worked at the farm and came away from it describing a place that did not feel right to her in ways she could not fully articulate, and which she did not report to any authority before she left. Her vacancy was the direct reason Maria Baumgartner was engaged. The farm needed a maid. The position had been left open by a woman whose departure had been premature enough that a replacement was sought. Maria Baumgartner was found from another district with no prior connection to the Gruber family, brought in to fill a role that had been vacated under circumstances that in hindsight would acquire a weight they did not carry at the time they occurred. The Munich newspaper is a specific small detail in the account of the farm's final days, and specific small details have a particular weight in a case where so much is uncertain. Gruber told neighbors that a newspaper, a Munich newspaper, delivered at intervals to the farmstead through whatever delivery or collection arrangement served rural properties in that district, had disappeared from the place where it was expected to be. Not that it had arrived and been read and set aside, that it had not been where it should have been, or had been absent when it should have been present, or had been removed from its expected location without any member of the household having moved it. The exact phrasing as it reached investigators through the accounts of those Gruber spoke to is not preserved verbatim in the sources available. What the record shows is that a newspaper was missing and that Gruber found this notable enough to mention. A newspaper in a rural farmstead in 1922 was not an incidental object. The distance from Hinterkaifeck to Munich was approximately 70 kilometers. A newspaper from the city, arriving at a remote property in the Schrobenhausen district, represented a particular kind of connection to the wider world, to news, to commerce, to the public events of a region and a country still finding its footing after the disruptions of the post-war years. It would not have been easy to replace if lost, and its disappearance from its expected location would have been a concrete, specific absence, not an ambiguity. Gruber noted it and mentioned it. The mention found its way into the record. It sits there alongside the footprints and the attic sounds as one of the things that the final week of March left behind in the accounts of those who spoke with the family. The keys were also reported missing. A set of keys to the farmhouse, the kind of functional, practical objects that a working household in 1922 would have had in a fixed place, used for the locking and securing of doors and storage, had disappeared without explanation in the same general period of the final days before the killings. Again, the detail comes through accounts gathered from neighbors who had spoken with members of the household, not from a formal report filed with any authority. Gruber mentioned the keys as he mentioned the newspaper as one of several small things that had not been where they should have been, that had not been accounted for by any member of the household who could have moved them. A missing key to a farmhouse is a more directly practical concern than a missing newspaper. A key controls access. Its absence means either that someone in the household had moved it and could not remember where, or that it had been taken, lost outside the house, dropped somewhere on the property, or removed by a person not among the household's 6 members. Gruber does not appear to have escalated this concern to any authority based on the record. He mentioned it, as he mentioned the other things, in conversation to people he knew, as part of a set of observations he was carrying in that final week. Whether the observations collectively produced a growing unease in him, or whether he considered each one separately and in a lower register than the whole would suggest in retrospect, The record does not confirm. What the record does show is that by the time Gruber was speaking to neighbors about these things, the footprints, the attic sounds, the newspaper, the keys, he had not reported any of them officially. No constable was called. No formal inquiry was lodged. The observations accumulated in private conversation and in the private knowledge of the household, and the household continued its daily life through the final days of March 1922, without any external intervention in response to what had been noticed. The farm's nearest neighbor was approximately 1 kilometer away. The town of Schrobenhausen lay roughly 10 kilometers distant. The structures through which a rural Bavarian family in 1922 might have sought assistance, a neighbor's advice, a word with the blacksmith, a longer journey to town, represented not just geographical distance, but the practical weight of interrupting a working farm's daily labor for something that remained at the level of what was known, a set of unexplained small events, footprints in snow, sounds from an attic, a missing paper, missing keys, no person seen, no direct threat made, each one a thing to note and mention and carry, not yet a pattern that had resolved itself into something requiring a different kind of response. The period between the estimated date of the killings and the arrival of the neighbors who discovered the household sits in the record as 4 days of continuing ordinary appearance. Investigators place the time of death at approximately the night of March 31st to April 1st, 1922. The neighbors who came on April 4th did not come because they had heard a disturbance or received an alarm. They came because the small accumulating signs of a household not functioning had finally reached the threshold of concern: the uncollected mail. The absence of any family member visible in the fields or yard. The 4 days of no contact with a household that, in the ordinary rhythms of rural life, would have been visible and present across the intervening period. In those 4 days between the estimated time of death and the April 4th arrival, neighbors and people passing on the main road observed smoke rising from the Hinterkaifeck chimney. This is documented. Multiple accounts describe the smoke as having been visible on more than one of those days, a steady, rising column from the farmhouse stack, the ordinary sign of a fire being fed, a stove at work, a household using its fuel as households do in the cold of early April in Upper Bavaria. Those who saw it read it as the natural evidence of occupation. The fire was burning. Someone was tending it. The household was present and doing what households did. The smoke rising from the chimney in those 4 days is one of the more quietly persistent facts in the Hinterkaifeck record. It is not a mystery in the sense of being unexplained. A fire burning in a stove produces chimney smoke, and a fire burning in a stove requires someone to add fuel to it, which is a concrete and physical act requiring physical presence at the farmstead. The smoke is the evidence that someone was there. It is not evidence of who, or in what circumstances, or with what knowledge of what had occurred in the barn. It is simply the smoke, rising, readable from the road, interpreted by those who saw it as the ordinary sign that the farm was continuing as it did. The mail was not collected. This is the detail that accumulated alongside the smoke, the observation that, whatever was happening inside the farmhouse that kept a fire burning, the exterior routines of the farm were not being maintained. Mail not collected means a person not going to the collection point, or not appearing in the yard, or not visible in any of the ways that a working farmer would have been visible in the ordinary course of early April days. A neighbor might note this once without concern, twice would draw attention. By the 3rd or 4th day without any sight of the family, the smoke and the uncollected mail would have stood in an increasingly strange relation to each other, one suggesting presence, the other suggesting absence, and this is precisely the tension that finally brought Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the other neighbors to the farm on April 4th. The school's absence of Celia Gabriel would also have been part of the accumulating concern. A 7-year-old child who walked the road between the farm and the village school, and who, by the account of her teacher, was present and engaged. Her non-attendance for multiple consecutive days would have been noted by those responsible for the school. Whether this specifically fed into the decision to visit the farm on April 4th, or whether it was part of the background of concern that had been quietly building in the community, the record does not confirm precisely. What it shows is that by April 4th, enough had accumulated, enough absence, enough unanswered questions, enough small signs of something not right, that the visit happened. The final days of March 1922 at Hinterkaifeck exist in the record in a particular way. They are reconstructed entirely from the accounts of people outside the household, neighbors who had spoken with Gruber, the blacksmith who had heard about the footprints, the former maid whose departure had prompted the employment of a replacement. Nothing of what the household itself experienced in those days survives from the household's own perspective, because none of the household survived. The record of those days is entirely second-hand, assembled by investigators from the testimony of people who were not there, who had spoken with those who were, and who offered their recollections at some point after the killings into an investigative process that was working backward from a discovery into a set of days that no longer had living witnesses. This gives the accounts of the final week a particular quality, not of unreliability, exactly, but of mediation. Gruber's exact words about the footprints, about the attic, about the newspaper and the keys, reached the investigators through his neighbor's memories of conversations. The former maid's sense of unease reached the record through accounts of what she had said to people she knew. Everything is at one remove from its source. This is not unusual in investigative work, particularly in a case where the primary witnesses did not survive to give testimony. It means that what the record holds is the shape of those final days, the confirmed broad outline of what was observed and noted and left unaddressed, rather than a detailed minute-by-minute account of how the household moved through the week. The outline is enough to show a farm in which unusual things were occurring, being noted and discussed, and not officially reported, through a period that ended with all 6 of its inhabitants dead. There is something in the texture of those reported conversations, Gruber at the blacksmith, Gruber with a neighbor, speaking about prints and snow and sounds from an attic, that the record holds without interpretation. He was talking. He was carrying these observations outside the walls of the farm and sharing them, selectively, with the people he encountered in the ordinary course of his week. Whether this was a man genuinely unsettled by what he had found, or a man cataloging minor anomalies in the matter-of-fact way of someone who had spent decades managing a remote property through all its ordinary difficulties, the record does not say. Both are possible. Both are consistent with what the account preserves. The observations were real. They were reported. They were not escalated. And this is where the record leaves them, in the final days of March, on a farm at the end of a narrow, unpaved track, where the snow still held its impressions, and the tree line still cast its shadows across ground that kept a record of everything that crossed it. The newspaper and the keys sit in the account as the smallest of the documented anomalies, but they have a quality that the attic sounds and the footprints do not quite share, which is that they describe objects absent from their expected places. A sound in an attic has the quality of something uncertain, difficult to fix, possible to attribute to the house itself, or to weather, or to the range of explanation that attaches to sounds in old buildings. A set of footprints in snow describes something external, visible, and specific, but does not necessarily require a more alarming interpretation than that someone had approached the farm and not by the time of the snow's preservation returned. A newspaper missing from a shelf, a key missing from a hook. These describe something removed. These describe a specific absence where a specific object should have been, and they describe it in the interior of the farmhouse itself, within the space where the household lived and worked and kept its things. Whether this distinction was present to Gruber as he noted and mentioned these things, or whether he grouped all of these observations together as a general sense that the farm had recently been producing more than the usual number of small anomalies, is not preserved in the record. What is preserved is that he mentioned the keys and the newspaper alongside the footprints and the sounds, all of it assembled in conversation, shared with neighbors, held within the household, rather than taken to any formal authority. The week continued, the farm continued, the smoke from the chimney continued to rise. In the days after April 1st, the farm was quiet in all the external ways that a farm can be quiet, while remaining apparently inhabited. The livestock were still there, the cattle, the horse, the smaller animals of a working Bavarian property, requiring care, requiring feeding, the rhythmic work of the barn continuing to be needed, whether anyone was providing it or not. The animals would have made themselves heard and visible in the ordinary ways of farm animals in the early days of April, their needs as present as they always were, independent of what had occurred among the human inhabitants of the property. They were alive on April 4th, when the neighbors arrived. They had been without proper care for the 3 or 4 days since the estimated time of death, and they were distressed but surviving, the creatures of a working farm outlasting the household that had tended them, still present in their stalls, still waiting in the way that animals wait, with no knowledge of what they were waiting for. The smoke that rose from the chimney on those 4 days is the last documented evidence of something active at Hinterkaifeck before the arrival of the neighbors on April 4th. Not the mail, which was absent, not the family, who were absent from the fields and the yard and the road, not the school attendance of a 7-year-old child, which had stopped. The smoke rising, visible, persistent, across multiple days, was what the outside world received from the farm in those final days of its apparent functioning. It is a real and documented observation. People saw it from the road and across the fields, and they read it as they would have read any chimney smoke on any morning in early April in rural Upper Bavaria. A fire being fed, a farm at work, a household present behind its walls, going about the business of keeping warm in the cold of an Upper Bavarian spring that had not yet fully arrived. The fire was real, the smoke was real. The days between the estimated time of death and the discovery on April 4th are held in the record as a set of documented observations. The smoke seen, the mail uncollected, the farm quiet, the chimney active, that together describe those 4 days without resolving what they mean. The record does not confirm who fed the fire. It does not confirm how many times fuel was added, or over how many of the 4 days the smoke was visible, or whether it was continuous or intermittent. It shows only that smoke was seen, that multiple people saw it, and that they came away from the sight of it with no particular alarm, only the ordinary understanding that the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was occupied, and its inhabitants were managing the cold as they did every year at this time of year, on this land, at the end of this narrow track, in this quiet corner of the Schrobenhausen district. The snow on the fields surrounding the farm in those 4 days of early April was still present, still firm enough at night, and in the cold morning hours, to hold impressions as it had held them throughout the final week of March. The ground that had recorded the single-direction trail from the tree line toward the farmstead continued to record whatever crossed it in the days that followed, what came and went across the open fields, what approached along the track, what left marks in the white surface of a landscape still wearing its winter coat in the first days of April 1922. The farm sat at the center of that ground as it always had, bordered by fields and tree line and the narrow unpaved track that connected it, at considerable distance, to the wider world it had always stood apart from. The smoke rose from the chimney, as it had risen every cold morning for as long as the farm had stood. Those who passed on the main road and saw it in the distance, across the pale and open fields of early April, saw what they had always seen, the ordinary evidence of a household continuing. The fire was burning, someone was tending it. The farm was there, as it had always been, at the end of its track, quiet behind its walls, its chimney smoke rising and dispersing into the cold air above the snow-covered ground that held, as that ground always held, every impression made upon it, every mark left by every crossing, patient and still, and waiting for the thaw to take them. On the morning of April 4th, 1922, a group of neighbors made their way along the unpaved track that led north from the main road toward the Hinterkaifeck farmstead. They came on foot. The walk itself was not unusual. Neighbors visited one another across these distances regularly, and the track between the farms was well enough known. What had changed in the days before this particular morning was the accumulation of small signs that something at the farm was not as it should be. The mail had not been collected. That was the detail that neighbors, and those who later gave accounts to investigators, returned to most consistently. Letters and a newspaper lying unclaimed in the box at the farm's entrance, accumulating across 2 days and then 3. For a working farm, where correspondence and news carried practical importance, uncollected mail over multiple days was a sign that warranted attention. Added to that was the absence of any member of the household from the yard or the fields during working hours. No figure moving between the barn and the house, no smoke from the chimney on certain mornings, and then, on other mornings, smoke which had initially reassured those who noticed it that the household was occupied and going about its days. The neighbors who made that walk on April 4th included Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a man from the surrounding district who was known to have had some personal connection with the family. There were several others with him. The documented record notes that it was a group decision to enter the property, not a single individual arriving alone, but a gathering of people from the nearby farms who had spoken among themselves about the signs they had each observed, and who agreed that enough had accumulated to justify going to the farm and making inquiries. They followed the track to its end. The yard came into view. What the yard showed them on that morning was a stillness, not the stillness of a farm at rest between tasks, not the ordinary quiet of an hour when the family might be inside eating or resting, but the particular stillness of a space where the usual signs of recent occupation were absent. There were no fresh tracks in the yard beyond those the neighbors themselves were making. The animals could be heard inside the barn. The farm did not look abandoned. Exactly. The structures were intact. The yard was arranged as it would have been in ordinary use, but nothing moved, and no one came to the door when the group called out. The neighbors entered the property. The documented sequence of what they found begins with the barn. 4 of the 6 people who had lived at Hinterkaifeck were found inside the barn section of the Wohnstall house, the connected agricultural half of the farmstead's main building, where the livestock were kept and where the daily work of a farm of this kind was organized around the animals' needs and the storage of hay and feed. Andreas Gruber was there. Cecilia Gruber, his wife, was there. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was there. And Victoria's daughter, 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, was found there as well, in the hay, in that enclosed agricultural space, in the company of the family members who had preceded her into the barn. The arrangement of the four, as investigators later documented it, was consistent with each person having entered the barn at a separate time, rather than all being present at once. This was one of the details that the initial investigation noted and returned to repeatedly. The physical disposition of the victims within the barn suggested a sequence, a series of individual arrivals, rather than a group of people who had been together in that space from the beginning. The investigation could not reconstruct that sequence with certainty, and it was never conclusively established. But the documented positions of the four were recorded, mapped, and held in the case file as one of the foundational observations of the scene. The two remaining members of the household were found separately inside the residential portion of the farmhouse. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had arrived at Hinterkaifeck on March 31st, one day before the investigators' estimated date of the killings, was found in the maid's quarters. She had been at the farm for a single night. The room where she was found was the room she would have been given on arrival, the place she would have set down her belongings when she came through the door of a household she had never visited before. She had come from outside the immediate district. The case file contains no indication that she had any prior personal knowledge of the Gruber family or any prior reason to know anything particular about the farm or its occupants. She had arrived, and then a night had passed, and that was the full extent of her time at Hinterkaifeck. The youngest member of the household, Josef Gabriel, a toddler of approximately 2 years. Victoria's son was found in his cot in the bedroom he had shared with his mother, inside the residential half of the house, separate from the four in the barn. The room was documented as a child's sleeping place, an ordinary domestic space inside the farmhouse proper, not the barn, not any of the outbuildings, but the interior of the home where the family's private life had been arranged. Josef was found there. The cause of death for all 6 victims, as the investigation established, and as the forensic examination of the time confirmed, was blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries were consistent with a heavy agricultural implement used in repeated blows, and investigators settled on a mattock, a broad-bladed digging tool common to working farms of this kind, as the most probable weapon based on the character and dimensions of the wounds. No weapon was confirmed as recovered from the scene. The determination remained at the level of a forensic conclusion drawn from the nature of the injuries, a probable shape and probable weight, inferred from what the blows had left behind, rather than a confirmed physical match to a specific implement found on the property. What the forensic record also documented was a specific detail regarding 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel. Tufts of her own hair were found clenched in her fist. The investigators at the scene noted this, recorded it, and it entered the case file as one of the confirmed findings from the barn. The interpretation that was placed on it, the one that the investigators working the case in 1922 and those who reviewed it in subsequent years consistently returned to, was that the child had remained conscious for a period after the initial attack. This was not a conclusion the forensic methods of the time could verify with precision. It was an inference drawn from a documented physical fact. The documented physical fact was the hair in the closed hand. What it meant for the sequence of events inside the barn on the night of March 31st to April 1st was a question the case file held without resolving. the neighbors who entered the barn that morning, on April 4th, were not trained investigators. This was a fact that would carry considerable weight for every subsequent phase of the case. They were farmers and local residents who had come to the farm out of concern for people they knew and who found themselves standing inside a crime scene without any preparation for what that meant, without any mechanism for preserving what they were standing in, and without any immediate authority to contact except the local reporting structure that would take time to mobilize. They moved through the barn. Other residents from the surrounding district, hearing what had been found, made their way to the farm as the morning went on. Before any official investigator had arrived at the property, the scene had been entered and moved through by a significant number of people. The hay had been disturbed. The positions of objects had shifted. Whatever impressions the floor of the barn might have held, in soil or straw or the particular give of a working agricultural surface, had been altered by the passage of many feet across it. Whatever trace evidence might have survived the days between the killings and the discovery, in the form of prints or deposits, or the undisturbed arrangement of the space as the perpetrator had left it, had been compromised by the time any authority arrived with the intention of reading the scene forensically. This was not negligence on the part of any individual. It was the consequence of how rural communities in this part of Bavaria in 1922 functioned in a moment of sudden catastrophe, without the institutional structure that would have kept the scene intact. But it meant that the investigation began with a significant and permanent loss. The examination that followed over the next days documented what could still be documented. Investigators noted the positions of the bodies as they had been found. They recorded the condition of the farmhouse and its contents, the domestic interior, the maid's quarters, the bedroom, the kitchen and storage areas. They noted what was present and what appeared to be absent. They noted the farm's tools, its animals, its arrangement. They worked from accounts given by the neighbors who had entered on April 4th about what they had observed before the scene was disturbed. The case file that was assembled from this work was substantial. It was also built from its earliest pages on a foundation that included acknowledged gaps, things that could not be recovered because the conditions for recovering them had already passed. One of the things investigators observed when they went through the farmhouse was that certain ordinary objects were in an unusual state. The stove had been used during the days after the killings. The fire had been fed. The farm had been kept to a degree, as though someone had remained on the property and maintained the practical necessities of the space. There were signs of food having been prepared. The livestock, as the neighbors had found when they arrived on April 4th, were alive but distressed. Cattle and a horse, and the farm's smaller animals, in their stalls having gone without proper care for several days but surviving, they had not been harmed. They had simply been left to the limits of their stalls when the routine of the farm stopped being observed. The animals' condition gave investigators a partial frame for the timeline. Livestock that go without feeding and water show the effects of that deprivation in ways that can be roughly estimated against elapsed time, and the state of the animals on April 4th was consistent with several days of inadequate care, which aligned with the investigators' estimate that the killings had occurred on or around the night of March 31st to April 1st. The farm's working creatures had continued, where the farm's people had not. They had waited inside their stalls through whatever had happened in the barn and the house on that night, and through the days that followed. The farmhouse itself, when investigators moved through it systematically, showed evidence that someone had remained on the property after the killings. The question of who that was, whether the perpetrator had stayed in the house, for how long, moving through the rooms and maintaining the fire, and perhaps eating from the household stores, was one that the investigation could observe the signs of, but could not answer with the evidence available. The fire in the stove was a documented fact. The used provisions were a documented fact. What these facts meant about the person or persons responsible for the deaths was a question the case file could hold but not resolve. The forensic work conducted on the victims in the days after the discovery included the removal of the 6 skulls, which were sent to Munich for analysis. The goal was to determine, from the nature and dimensions of the wounds on each skull, the probable shape and weight of the implement used, a forensic approach consistent with the methods available in 1922, and one that in principle offered the best available path to a more precise characterization of the weapon. The analysis was conducted. It produced findings. Those findings were filed, and they became part of the case record, and investigators drew on them in the years that followed. The skulls were subsequently lost. The accounts of how this happened differ in their details. Some of the documentation from the period points toward administrative disorder in the aftermath of the First World War, a time when institutional records across Germany were fragmented and official archives in various states of disorganization. Other accounts suggest the physical evidence was destroyed during the Second World War, when a great deal of archival and forensic material held in German institutions did not survive. What the record confirms is the end result. The most direct physical evidence linking the weapon to the wounds was eventually no longer available for re-examination. Whatever a modern forensic analysis might have been able to recover or refine from the skulls, with methods unavailable in 1922, became a question the case could not answer because the primary materials were gone. Thematic determination remained, therefore, as an inference from documentation rather than from the physical evidence itself. It was a well-reasoned inference, grounded in the detailed observations made by the investigators who had examined the skulls before they were lost, and it persisted as the most probable forensic conclusion through every subsequent phase of the case. But it was inference from a documented record rather than from materials that could be retested, remeasured, or re-examined with fresh methods. The condition of the barn in those first days of investigation, and the farmhouse through which investigators moved to compile their records, was the condition of a place that had been a working household and was now a crime scene at the end of its working life. The tools were present. The stores were there. The furniture and the domestic objects were in place. The maid's room held the belongings Maria Baumgartner had brought with her from outside the district on March 31st. The cot in the bedroom held what a cot in a room shared between a young mother and her toddler would hold. The kitchen and its preserves, the dairy stores, the winter provisions that a self-sufficient farm in Upper Bavaria would have kept against the season, all of these were present, largely intact, available for documentation and inventory. What the farmhouse did not hold, by the time investigators had completed their initial pass through the property, was any obvious physical trace that pointed unambiguously to a particular person. No implement was confirmed as the weapon. No object clearly left behind by the perpetrator was identified. The investigation produced a substantial record of what the farm contained, and that record was cross-referenced against the accounts of neighbors and local tradespeople who had had dealings with the family, and against the observations of those who had entered on April 4th. From all of this, investigators assembled what they had. They noted what they could not account for. The case file grew through the spring and into the summer of 1922, as interviews accumulated and reports were filed. The neighbors and local community who had known the Gruber family provided accounts of what they had observed in the weeks before the killings. the footprints crossing the snow from the tree line toward the farm, which Andreas Gruber had mentioned to people he encountered in the final days of March. The sounds from the attic that Andreas had described, the previous maid who had left the position weeks earlier, feeling an unease she had articulated to those she knew without being able to give it a precise form. The missing keys, the missing newspaper. All of these details entered the investigative record as reported information, things that witnesses said had occurred, things that Andreas Gruber or others had mentioned in conversations that neighbors could later recall and describe. They were not physical evidence. They were testimony gathered retrospectively from a community that had been living in ordinary proximity to a farm where something had already begun to go wrong, without knowing what it was or that it would end as it did. The investigation moved through the spring and summer of 1922 with the particular difficulty of a case that had lost its scene before it could be properly read, and whose primary physical evidence was limited from the beginning. Investigators interviewed neighbors, tradespeople, anyone with a connection to the family or the farm. They examined the documented history of the Gruber household, the family's relationships within the district, the financial records of the farm, the social standing of Andreas Gruber among his neighbors, the history of Victoria Gabriel as a widow and a mother. They pursued leads. Some of those leads led further. Some of them stopped. The case was worked through 1922 and into the years that followed without producing a charge against any individual. No one was arrested. No one was brought before a court. The investigation remained formally open, a file that existed in the Bavarian legal and investigative system, containing what it contained, classified as an unsolved homicide, revisited at intervals by investigators who reviewed the accumulated materials and sometimes added to them, but who could not close the gap between what the evidence showed and what a prosecution would require. The farm itself continued to stand through 1922, documented and examined, and eventually cleared of whatever investigative interest it could still yield. In 1923, the farmstead was demolished. The Wohnstall house, with its single shared roof line spanning both house and barn, the connected structure that had held the daily life of the Gruber family and the final hours of all 6 of its inhabitants, the building was taken down and the land returned to the agricultural landscape that surrounded it. What had been a working farm became a field. The narrow, unpaved track that had led to it from the main road still ran through the landscape, still branched from the same point, and moved in the same direction, but the building it had led to was gone. The central yard enclosed by the outbuildings, the tool shed, the woodshed, the small storage structures that had held the particular inventory of a working farm's daily needs, was no longer enclosed by anything once the main structures came down. The fields absorbed the space. The agricultural land of Upper Bavaria, north of Munich, continued as it had continued through the winters and springs before the farm was built and before the family who worked it was born. The investigation continued to be revisited in the decades that followed. New investigators picked up the case file. New accounts emerged as people who had known the Grubers or lived near them aged and gave testimony they had not given before, or gave different versions of testimony they had given years earlier. The accumulated documentation grew. The question at the center of it, who had entered the Hinterkaifeck farmstead on the night of March 31st to April 1st, 1922, and had not been accounted for in any of the outward-facing records of that night, remained the question it had always been. A number of people were considered as suspects over the years. The investigation's attention turned, at various points, to individuals who had been known to have dealings with the farm or with members of the family. and to individuals whose whereabouts on the relevant night could not be confirmed to investigators' satisfaction. Of these, the name that appeared most consistently in the investigative record across the decades was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had been part of the group that entered the farm on April 4th and who had a documented personal connection to Victoria Gabriel. Schlittenbauer was questioned multiple times. Investigators reviewed his accounts against the physical and testimonial evidence available. He was never charged. The evidence that might have supported a charge was not, as investigators found it, sufficient for that purpose. What the record holds regarding Schlittenbauer is that he was a known figure in the case, that investigators returned to him across years and different phases of the investigation, and that the case did not produce a legal resolution of the question his name raised. The file continued to list the murders at Hinterkaifeck as unsolved. The cattle that had been found alive on April 4th, distressed in their stalls, were documented in the investigative record as among the specific findings of that morning. They had remained through whatever had happened in the barn and the house. They had been tended in the days after the killings, in the minimal way that someone remaining on the property had tended them or not tended them, and relied on what they had. They were living creatures that had been present throughout, that had survived the event, that had not spared the 6 people who cared for them, and that were found by the neighbors who came to the farm on the morning of discovery in the specific condition that several days without proper attention produces in large working animals. Their survival was not remarkable in any forensic sense. Animals are often unharmed in events of this kind. The documented record of farm animals surviving while household members did not is not unusual in cases of rural homicide, and investigators drew no special inference from it. But the fact of the cattle in their stalls and the horse and the smaller livestock of the farm existing through those days inside the same structure where the 4 members of the family had been found. This was a documented feature of the scene as it was found, and it sat in the case file alongside the other confirmed details, unremarkable in forensic terms and quietly persistent as a fact. The farm had been a working place. The animals had been part of that working. They had required daily attention, and the daily attention had been given to them for years before March 31st, and was absent for the days that followed, and they had lived through that absence and been found in their stalls when the neighbors arrived. The person or persons who had entered the farmstead on that night had left the animals. The animals had continued. By the time the farmstead was demolished in 1923, and by the time the land had returned to its place in the agricultural landscape of Upper Bavaria, the case that the investigation had been building since April 4th was already more than a year old. The scene was gone, not through the work of the investigation, but through the ordinary process of a demolished building returning to open ground. The documents, the interview records, the forensic reports, and the photographs taken in the days after the discovery, the accumulated testimony of neighbors and tradespeople and local officials, all of this persisted in the archive, carrying what the investigation had been able to establish and the larger shape of what it had not. The full weight of the 4 found in the barn, and Maria Baumgartner in the maid's quarters, and Josef Gabriel in his cot, 6 lives, 6 documented deaths, 6 sets of circumstances held in the case file and in the memories of the community that had known them, was a weight that no subsequent reinvestigation has been able to lift by providing the one thing the record has always lacked, a confirmed accounting for who was responsible. The animals were gone from the farm by then as well, dispersed presumably when the farm ceased to function as a farm. The stalls were empty before the building was taken down. The landscape absorbed the space the building had occupied, and the fields north of Munich continued in their seasons, the tree line at the property's edge casting its shadows across the open agricultural ground, as they had always cast them through the long winters and the slow springs of that part of Bavaria. What remained on April 4th, inside the stalls of the Wohnstall house, after the neighbors had moved through the barn and the house and the investigators had been summoned, was the sound of the cattle in their stalls, a low, continuous sound, audible through the shared wall between the residential and agricultural halves of the building, the sound of living animals in a confined space that had not been disturbed by whatever had occurred in the spaces adjacent to them. The horse moved, the cattle breathed. The farm was quiet in every other respect, and the animals were alive inside it, and the neighbors who had come down the unpaved track that morning stood in the yard and listened to the sound of the working life of the farm continuing from inside the barn, and that sound was, in its way, one of the most documented and lasting facts that the case file would carry from that morning forward. The living creatures of Hinterkaifeck, the cattle, the horse, the farm's smaller animals, had been tended for years by the 6 people whose remains the neighbors found on April 4th. They had been fed and watered and kept according to the daily rhythms that a working farm in this part of Bavaria required. They had been part of the household's economy and its labor. They had stood in their stalls through the nights of every winter the family had kept them, and through the night of March 31st, and through the days that followed. And when the neighbors arrived and moved through the property, and the documentation of the scene began, the animals were there, present, living, continuing, inside the same walls, under the same shared roof, in the stalls that adjoined the barn, where 4 of the 6 had been found. The breath of the cattle faintly warm in the cold air of that early April morning, the particular sound of a working farm's animals carrying through the wall between the 2 halves of the building, as it would have carried on any ordinary day. On the morning of April 4th, 1922, before any investigator had walked the property, before any official record of what had been found at Hinterkaifeck had been entered into any file, the neighbors who had entered the farm moved through the barn and into the farmhouse, carrying the weight of what they had discovered, and others followed them. Word moved through the district in the way that word moved in 1922, on foot, by cart, along the same unpaved tracks that connected one farm to another across the Bavarian countryside north of Munich. And the people who heard came to see. By the time the first official investigators arrived at the farmstead, a significant number of local residents had already walked through the barn, passed through the residential quarters, stood in the spaces where the 6 members of the household had been found. Whatever trace evidence had survived the days between the night of March 31st and the morning of April 4th, footprints in the dirt of the barn floor, the positioning of objects disturbed or moved, fingerprints on the interior surfaces of the house, had been crossed and recrossed and handled until the physical record of what had happened there was no longer intact. This was the first and most consequential fact in the long history of the Hinterkaifeck investigation. Everything that came after it was shaped, in some degree, by what had already been lost. The investigators, who arrived in the days following the discovery, did what they could with what remained available to them. The 6 victims were examined. Cause of death was established. Blunt force trauma, consistent with a heavy agricultural implement. The probable weapon, identified from the nature and shape of the wounds as a mattock, a broad-bladed tool common to working farms of the period. The bodies were documented. The barn and the farmhouse were recorded as thoroughly as the circumstances allowed. And then the work of questioning began. Neighbors, distant relatives, tradespeople, anyone who had had contact with the Gruber family in the weeks and months before the killings. The investigators gathered what accounts they could. Andreas Gruber had mentioned the one-directional footprints in the snow to a neighbor. He had mentioned unexplained sounds from the attic to the local blacksmith. The former maid had told people she knew about a persistent unease she had felt at the farm before she left her position there. These details entered the record. They remained in the record. They did not, in the weeks and months of that initial investigation, lead to a charge. The town of Schrobenhausen, 10 kilometers from the farmstead, held the administrative center of the district. It was there that the early documentation of the case was filed, accumulated, and kept. The investigative record from 1922 runs to a substantial body of paper, interview transcripts, site reports, correspondence between investigators, the findings of the forensic examination. The case was taken seriously from the beginning. The scale of what had happened at Hinterkaifeck, 6 people killed in a single event, made it serious from the moment it became known. The Bavarian investigators worked it with the resources and methodologies available to them in the early 1920s. What they produced was a thorough documentary record of what had been gathered, what had been observed, what witnesses had reported, and what had not been resolved. That record was filed. It remained in the system that held such things. The skulls of the 6 victims had been removed from the scene and sent to Munich for forensic cranial analysis. The purpose was specific, to determine from the shape and depth and distribution of the wounds what kind of implement had caused them, to narrow the probable weapon from the physical evidence that the bodies themselves carried. The analysis was conducted. A report was produced. The mattock was identified as consistent with the injuries, and then the skulls were lost. Some accounts place the loss in the administrative disruptions of the post-World War I period, the period of social and governmental instability that followed Germany's defeat, when institutions were in flux and the ordinary systems for maintaining records and physical evidence were unreliable. Other accounts suggested the skulls had been destroyed during the Second World War, when so much of what had been held in German institutional archives was damaged or burned or simply ceased to exist. What is documented is the outcome. The skulls were not available to subsequent investigators. The most direct physical evidence of what had been done to the 6 people at Hinterkaifeck, the evidence that had been specifically preserved and sent for analysis, was gone from the record before the case had been resolved. This kind of compounding loss is not unusual in investigations that span decades. Evidence held in the 1920s was held within the institutional frameworks of the 1920s, frameworks that did not anticipate a Second World War, that did not anticipate the lengths of time over which an unresolved case might need to be re-examined. Files were not always kept. Physical evidence was not always stored with the durability of future reviews in mind. The Hinterkaifeck case accumulated these losses as the years moved through the century, each one narrowing the evidentiary basis on which any future analysis could operate, each one a door that had closed and would not reopen. The investigators of 1922 had worked within those limitations. The investigators who returned to the case in later years would work within them too. Lorenz Schwittenbauer was one of the neighbors who had entered the farm on the morning of April 4th. He was among the group who found the bodies. He was the man who had been documented as having a personal connection to Victoria Gabriel, a connection whose precise nature was noted in the investigative record and discussed among the investigators at the time, without ever being formally and publicly confirmed beyond what the record itself contained. The investigators questioned him. They questioned him more than once. Over the years that followed, as the case remained open and different investigators reviewed the material, Schlittenbauer's name continued to appear. The lines of inquiry that ran through the documented record of the case consistently returned to him. His knowledge of the farm's layout, his behavior during the discovery, his relationship with the household, his presence on the property in the period before the killings. These details were in the file. They were examined. They did not produce sufficient evidence for a charge. The investigation went forward without a conclusion, and Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained in the record as a figure of documented inquiry rather than established guilt. There were other names in the file as well. A traveling craftsman who had worked at the property in the weeks before the killings, a former farmhand with a history of contact with the Gruber household, various individuals from the district whose movements in late March and early April of 1922 were examined and noted. Some of these lines of inquiry were pursued further than others. Some produced accounts that were internally consistent and were eventually set aside. Some produced inconsistencies that investigators noted and returned to. None of them produced the evidence that would have closed the case. What the file held, after the initial investigation was complete, was a set of documented possibilities and a set of documented absences, the things that had been established and the things that remained open, held together in the same record, neither one resolving into the other. The years passed, the case remained in the system as an unsolved matter. Bavarian law enforcement maintained the file. The investigation was revisited at intervals when new leads emerged, or when renewed attention to the case prompted a fresh examination of the existing material. Each review produced its own additions to the documentary record, further interviews, assessments of the earlier findings, notes on the current state of the evidence, and what was still available to examine. None of these revisitations produced a charge. The case moved further from its origin point with each passing year, the witnesses aging and dying, the physical environment of the crime changing and eventually being removed entirely from the landscape. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was demolished in 1923. 1 year after the killing, the structure, the elongated Wohnstall house with its shared roofline spanning the residential quarters and the barn, the outbuildings that had enclosed the central yard, the tool shed and the woodshed and the smaller storage structures that had been the quiet inventory of a working farm's daily life, was gone. The land itself remained. The fields around the site continued as agricultural ground, tended by different hands, continuing through their ordinary seasonal patterns. From the road, from any distance, there was nothing left to mark what had stood there. The narrow, unpaved track still branched from the main road and ran toward the tree line, but the farmstead it had led to was not there anymore. The farm had ended. The land continued. A memorial stone was placed at the site in later years, a fixed point in the open agricultural ground north of Munich, bearing the names of the 6 people who had lived and died at Hinterkaifeck. It became a point of quiet visitation. Locals came to it. Historians and researchers came to it. People who had read about the case, who had followed it through its documentary record, or through the popular accounts that accumulated around it across the decades, came to stand at the place where the farm had been. The stone held the names without interpretation: Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, the 7-year-old Cecilia, Gabriel, Josef Gabriel, Maria Baumgartner, the woman who had arrived on March 31st, and whose time at the farm had lasted a single day. The names in stone, the fields continuing around them in every direction. The popular cultural record of Hinterkaifeck is substantial. In Germany, the case became one of the most discussed unsolved criminal investigations of the 20th century. Books were written about it, journalistic investigations were conducted, documentaries were produced. Each new treatment of the case brought the documented facts to a new audience and generally produced a new round of public discussion about who might have been responsible. The coverage was not always careful about the distinction between what the documentary record confirmed and what remained in the domain of theory or speculation. Some accounts presented the incest allegations, the documented suspicions about Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria, the documented questions about the paternity of Josef Gabriel, as established fact rather than as what they were. Matters that had been investigated, that had resulted in a legal proceeding before the killings, and that had not been conclusively resolved in the documentary record. The popular accounts of the case and the evidentiary record of the case were not always the same thing. This is a distinction worth holding. What the investigation documented, clearly and without dispute, was the following. 6 people were killed at Hinterkaifeck in the night of March 31st to April 1st, 1922. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The property showed evidence of occupation after the killings, a fire maintained in the farmhouse, the livestock attended to, the farm appearing from the outside to be functioning. The crime scene was extensively contaminated before official investigators arrived. Key physical evidence was subsequently lost. No charge was ever brought. These were the fixed coordinates of the case, and they remained fixed across every investigation and reinvestigation, across every popular account and scholarly review, across the decades that separated the night of the killings from the present. In 2007, students from a German university criminology program undertook a structured reinvestigation of the Hinterkaifeck case. The project was designed as an academic exercise in applying contemporary investigative frameworks and criminal profiling methodologies to a historical case, to work through the surviving documentary evidence using the analytical tools of modern criminology and produce a formal report on the findings. The surviving record was substantial enough to work with. The interview transcripts from 1922, the site reports, the documented accounts of the strange occurrences in the days before the killings, the detailed record of the various suspects who had been questioned across the decades. All of this was available. The students worked through it systematically. They applied the frameworks. They produced their report. The report named Lorenz Schlittenbauer as the most probable perpetrator. The finding was not presented as a legal determination. The students were clear that what they had produced was a probabilistic assessment based on the application of contemporary profiling frameworks to an incomplete historical record, not a conclusion that met the standard of criminal evidence. The report was a criminological document, not a legal one. It could not charge anyone. It could not close the case. What it could do, and did, was offer a structured and methodologically grounded analysis of the available evidence that reached a specific conclusion. And that conclusion, when the report was covered in the German media, brought the Hinterkaifeck case back to wide public attention in a way it had not experienced for some time. The coverage that followed the 2007 report generated renewed discussion of the case in Germany and through the reach of international media in other countries as well. The documentary record was made more widely available. The accounts of the days before the killings, the one-directional footprints, the unexplained sounds from the attic, the missing newspaper, and the missing keys, the departure of the former maid, were rehearsed again for new audiences. Lorenz Schlittenbauer's name was discussed with the specificity that the student's report had given it. The case existed in a different cultural register than it had before. It was not new. It was more than 80 years old. but it was newly present, newly legible to people who had not known it before the report brought it forward, and the case remained open. The 2007 report was not a closing of the file, it was an addition to it. Another document in the accumulated record, another layer in the long history of the investigation. The Hinterkaifeck case is listed in the records of Bavarian law enforcement as unsolved. It will likely remain so. The evidence that would have been needed to charge anyone in 1922 was severely compromised before the investigation had properly begun. The evidence that might have supported a definitive determination in later decades, the skulls, the physical materials from the crime scene, was gone. What the file holds in its current form is a complete documentary record of an investigation that ran for decades, reviewed its own findings repeatedly, applied every method available to it at each stage, and arrived at no legal conclusion. There is something particular in the way an investigation like this one exists in the archive, not as a failure exactly, but as a record of what documentation can hold and what it cannot reach. The file contains everything that was gathered. It contains the dimensions of the farmstead, the names and ages of the 6 people who lived there, the accounts that neighbors gave of what Andreas Gruber had told them in the days before the killings, the forensic assessment of the wounds, the transcript of every interview conducted in 1922 and after. It contains the names of suspects and the documented reasons they were considered. It contains the record of every limitation, the contaminated scene, the lost skulls, the absence of physical evidence that might have been decisive. The file is a complete account of a thorough investigation's encounter with what it was given to work with. The resolution the investigation did not produce is also there, in the file, present in the form of the question that was never answered, held in the record alongside everything else. The land where the farm stood is agricultural ground now, as it has been since the demolition in 1923. The fields north of Munich continue in their seasonal patterns. The narrow track that branches from the main road and runs toward the tree line is still traceable, on maps in local memory, in the landscape itself, which holds the memory of its own arrangements long after the structures built upon it have been removed. The ground that preserved footprints in the snow of late March 1922 is the same ground that lies quiet under summer crops and under winter frost each year. It does not distinguish between seasons. It does not hold the particular weight of what happened on it differently than it holds anything else. It is ground. The memorial stone marks where the farmhouse stood. It is a modest fixture in the open landscape, not a monument in any grand sense, simply a marker, a point of reference for those who come looking for the place. The names are carved into it, all 6 of them. The stone has been there through the seasons since it was placed, through the decades of continuing public attention to the case, through the waves of new accounts and reinvestigations and popular treatments of the story. It does not change with any of that. It holds the names. The fields around it continue. There is a quality specific to cases that carry across the full length of a century, a quality different from cases that are merely old, merely unresolved in the ordinary sense of an investigation that ran out of evidence or leads. The Hinterkaifeck case has moved through enough time now that the world in which it occurred is not recoverable except through the documentary record it left. The people who were questioned in 1922 are gone. The investigators who compiled the first files are gone. The landscapes of rural Bavaria in the early 1920s, the particular conditions of the post-war years, the poverty and the social disruption, the isolation of working farms in the Schrobenhausen district, the specific quality of the world in which 6 people lived together and were killed, exist now only in the record that documented them. What the file preserves is not the world, it is what the world left in writing. The investigation asked for decades a question it could not finally answer. Who had come to the farm? Who had stayed there in the days that followed? Who had fed the fire and attended to the livestock while the household was gone from the world? The question is in the file. It has always been in the file. Every investigator who opened the file encountered it in the same form: the documented anomalies of the days before the killings, the evidence of continued occupation afterward, the absence of a confirmed perpetrator. The question accumulated documentation around it without the documentation resolving it. That is what the file contains. That is what it has always contained. The farm animals found alive on April 4th, 1922, the cattle in their stalls, the horse in the barn, the smaller livestock that had gone several days without proper care, were attending in their way to the only world they had access to. They had been fed in the days after the killings, or they had survived on what was already in the barn. They were alive when the neighbors came. They were distressed but not dying. The working creatures of the farm had continued in the absence of the household that had kept them, surviving within the same walls that held everything else about the case: the evidence, the questions, the days that passed with chimney smoke rising from the farmhouse, and the mail uncollected, and the narrow track undisturbed by any ordinary coming and going from the village. By the time the investigators arrived, the animals had already been there through the whole of what the farm knew. Whatever the barn had held in the night of March 31st, whatever the days of April 1st and 2nd and 3rd had been inside those walls, the animals had been present for it. They had continued. They would have continued to continue for as long as there was something to eat and water to drink. The farm's working life had a patience and a persistence that the investigation would eventually come to share. Patient, persistent, and without a final resolution to offer. What the Hinterkaifeck investigation produced in its long history was a record. A thorough, detailed, many-layered record of a crime that was taken seriously from the beginning, investigated with the resources of each period in which it was examined, revisited by academics and criminologists with the methodologies of contemporary analysis, and never closed. The record is held in the Bavarian archives. The file exists. The interview transcripts from 1922 are there. The site reports are there. The forensic findings, incomplete as they became after the loss of the skulls, are there. The notes from subsequent reviews are there. The 2007 criminology report is there. The accumulated documentation of more than a century of engagement with this case is there, in the system that holds such things, in the form that 100 years of careful record-keeping has given it. The narrow track through the Bavarian countryside north of Munich is still there, branching from the main road and running toward the tree line in the same direction it ran in March of 1922. The ground along it holds its seasonal patterns. Snow comes in late winter and lies across the fields and holds in its surface the record of every crossing made upon it. It thaws in spring. It freezes again the following year. The fields receive what falls on them and preserve it until the season changes. The tree line casts its long shadows across the open ground in the same directions they have always fallen. The land continues in its ordinary way, holding no particular account of what has happened on it, simply continuing as land does, patient and quiet and entirely without urgency. The case file holds what the land does not. The case file holds the names, the dates, the documented facts, the open questions, the investigative conclusions that were reached, and the investigative conclusions that were not. It holds the specific detail of a set of footprints in the snow, observed and reported, and entered into the record. A single trail crossing a field from the tree line toward a farmstead, with no return path visible in the surrounding snow. The detail that a man named Andreas Gruber mentioned to a neighbor and to the local blacksmith in the final week of March 1922, and that investigators later noted as among the last things he is documented to have reported observing before the night of March 31st. That detail is in the file. The file is in the archive. The archive continues to hold it, as it holds everything else the case accumulated across the century. The living and the dead of Hinterkaifeck, the questions asked and unanswered, the record of what was known and what remained and still remains open. The memorial stone stands in the fields north of Munich, where the farmstead stood. The names carved into it are the names of 6 people who lived on a farm at the end of a narrow, unpaved track in a district of Upper Bavaria in the years following the First World War. The stone does not resolve the case. It does not offer an explanation.